am now entering my 5th year as a regular heroin user. These are not the words of an addict or someone you may imagine is your typical heroin user. To the contrary, this is an admission of Columbia University neuroscientist Professor Carl Hart. In his highly controversial new book, Drug Use of Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, Dr. Hart makes a full-throated endorsement of the use of opiates for recreational use. I go one-on-one with Dr. Hart, coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Welcome, Dr. Hart. So glad to have this opportunity to sit down and talk with you this morning about this book. This book struck so many nerves with me, someone who grew up in a housing project in North St. Louis and had the experience of living with and around people who were addicted to drugs and seeing the impact of drug use on their lives. I was really fascinated with your I guess what we can call radical approach to drug use. So I just want to ask you, first of all, what has the response to your new book been? Primarily, I'm thinking right now from the scientific community, because I know you are a neuroscientist yourself. So how have your peers responded to this book?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about people who actually read the book or people who read like the intro, what you read, and without putting it in context. If you have somebody who read the book, they loved it. They understood that it certainly is not addressing drug addiction. My last book, High Price, kind of dealt with that. And my 30-year career in the field deals with addiction. But I tried to help people to understand that this is really about love, liberty, freedom, trying to help people to understand that the drug war has been used to subjugate communities like Black communities. And it's not drugs, but it's the drug war. The police and their power has led to these sort of disruptions in our community, and more so than the drugs, and trying to help people to understand that they got hoodwinked. And it's like saying that if you focus on drug addiction all the time when you talk about drugs, it's like saying, all right, I'm interested in cars. I want to know about the latest, Mercedes, but yet the only thing people want to talk about is car accidents. Most people who use drugs don't have those problems that you kind of delineated at the beginning. And so I try to help people to focus on the data. So when I think about the scientific community who read the book and who understand, particularly those who are concerned about subjugation of Black people, they love it.
Yeah, and I know that you received glowing reviews for the book from NPR and the New York Times. So as controversial as the book is, there are definitely some reputable mainstream, I'll call it, media organizations that have embraced the book and have given high praise to it. The book, as you just articulated, is really about also shining a spotlight on the war on drugs that we saw take place in this country in the 70s and the 80s. And in some ways, I think the book is your war on drugs, and you calling out how that war, as you just indicated, demonized in ways the African American and Latinx and Black and brown communities. What are you hoping that people who were responsible, those elected officials, those government officials who were involved in the war on drugs and today setting our drug policies, what do you want them to learn from this book?
It's a complicated question because on the one hand, when we think about the people who are responsible, the guy in the White House, Joe Biden, is one of the crafters of some of the worst legislation for Black people when it comes to drugs. When you think about the crack powder phenomenon, the law that punished crack users 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine users, even though the drugs are the same. And Black people, in some cases, on average, were arrested 80 80% of those people arrested for crack were Black people, even though they don't make up the majority of the users of crack or even the sellers of crack. They were the ones who paid the heavy price, or our people paid the heavy price. And Joe Biden, as I pointed out, was the crafter of that law and the main proponent of that law. But then when we had our choice to vote in 2020, you couldn't vote for the other guy because that was even worse. So you had to go with Joe Biden. And so that makes it complicated. So now that you voted for Joe Biden, we voted for Joe Biden. It's like I hope that people would hold him accountable, but it hasn't happened. People haven't said, these laws were in place primarily because when Biden was the head of the Judiciary Committee, these things happened, and he pushed for these things, and there hasn't been a reckoning. People haven't forced this sort of reckoning because oftentimes people just are not aware, but I tried to write about these things so people would understand. It's like we vote for these people, but they still sell us out, basically. And that doesn't mean that you have to vote for the other side. It just means that you have to keep people accountable. And so I hope the book helped people to understand that it's complicated. The guys that we voted for oftentimes are the ones that participate largely in our subjugation.
I want to step back a little, Professor, and talk about how you got to this position, because you didn't always have this approach and ideology to drugs and their impact, particularly on Black and brown communities. So let's go back. I watched a videotape of you talking about how you grew up and what your surroundings were like in that part of Miami where you grew up. So talk a little about your upbringing and how that upbringing has helped to shape your thoughts and philosophy on drug use today.
Yeah, I grew up in the hood, as they say, in the 1970s. Well, I'm born in the 60s, grew up mainly in the 70s and the 80s. And when I was in 84 or so, I went to the Air Force because, that was the main opportunity for somebody like me. And of course, growing up in the hood, you see all of these things that people say, drugs, crime, all those things people say. Oftentimes we misattribute what's really happening. We misattribute causes. It's easy to point to drugs, but it's a lot more complicated to point to like specific policies, like when Ronald Reagan was president in the 1980s. There were many programs that were cut, and that contributed to a great deal of problems too. That contributed to lack of opportunity.
Professor Hart, I want to step back for a second. So you, growing up in that hood community in Miami, you used drugs, and I think I read even sold drugs at one point early on in your life. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I sold drugs in high school, but minor stuff. That people who, my friends who were really moving weight, many of them did 10, 20 years behind bars. A lot of them did times, and some of them got even worse, they're no longer with us. And so, yeah, I saw all of those things. And so
you too, at that point, right, thought that the decay of your community and communities like yours was because of the pervasive nature of drug use and drug sales in those communities. That was your original thought, right, about drugs.
Absolutely. I thought that drugs were the cause, the reason why the community was not doing as well. And so my time in the Air Force helped me to step back and think about what I wanted to do with my life. And I started to go to university, eventually got a PhD, and I wanted to focus on the neurobiology of drug addiction because I wanted to cure drug addiction as a problem, because I thought if I did that, then I could be addressing some of the issues in our community. So I spent the last 30 years studying the neurobiology of drug addiction and drugs and trying to figure out what's really going on. But then over this course of study, I realized I got hoodwinked just like everybody else. For example, I thought that most people who use these drugs were addicted, when in fact, maybe 10, at most 30% of the people who use any of these drugs ever become addicted. And that tells you that the vast majority of people don't. And it also tells you that if the majority of people don't become addicted, then you can't blame drugs. You have to look beyond drugs, even for something like drug addiction. And so all of these things start to become more clear to me after some 3 decades or so of study. And that's like, the book is a culmination of all of that knowledge and trying to help people to understand it's really about taking care of people in our society, being in the military, thinking about these issues of patriotism and taking care of people, and we got it twisted in the United States. We have it so backwards that I tried to help people to go back to the very document that founded the country, the Declaration of Independence, basic sort of thing like people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that sort of thing. If you have that right, then why are we arresting millions of people every year for drugs? We are doing so because people thought that drugs were destroying the community. And it's like, it's not drugs, it's beyond drugs. And so I'm trying to help people to understand that.
So one of the things you talk about in the book, Professor, is this notion of responsible drug use by grownups. And you talked about this life, liberty, freedoms, and that if people have freedoms in this country, why are we arresting them or criminalizing their drug use? I guess I struggle with this notion of who's a responsible grown-up. And you do talk about, people who are taking care of their children, who are, functioning on their jobs, who are responsible. But it feels like to me that it's going to be impossible for us to know who those quote unquote responsible people are versus those who would be deemed, not responsible. How do you make that distinction?
It's 7:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock on the West Coast, and you and I are having this conversation. So in order to have this conversation, we have to be responsible. You go out on your freeways, your highways, people are driving cars, and most of them are not getting in accidents. They're not driving crazy or wild. That's responsible. In our society, we see this play out every day. I don't understand. It seems like when we think about something like drug use, we become dumb and not realize that people are responsible all the time. People take their kids to school. People pick up their kids. That people pay their taxes. People they meet appointments. They do all of these things. That's responsible. I mean, and
let me just ask you this: then, that person who you've just described as responsible, is there any impact on their ability to function from if they use drugs on a regular basis? And to be clear, you're not just talking about cannabis, you're talking about a wide spectrum of drugs, including even heroin, right?
Yeah, but like even this conversation, like I'm using a drug right now. I'm drinking tea. I drink tea regularly. It's a drug, and it helps me to be more alert in the morning. And so, but I'm taking it in the oral form. I'm not shooting it in my vein, for example.
But you wouldn't equate tea with heroin, would you, in terms of how it impacts one's body?
Well,
and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm asking you, like, should we think of tea as the same biological, it has the same impact on our body physiologically as heroin would have?
So these are the things that I cover in the book, right? So to help people to understand these things, obviously heroin and tea are not equivalent in many respects, but they both are psychoactive substances that can alter our consciousness. When you think about if somebody for example, shoot heroin, that means that the drug is dumped immediately into the bloodstream. You feel the effect like that. If you shoot alcohol, you also will feel the effect like that, and it'll be highly intoxicating, just like heroin can be highly intoxicating. And if you shoot alcohol, or even if you drink alcohol on a regular basis, and then you abruptly discontinue your use such that you go through withdrawal, that withdrawal can kill you. If you do the same thing with heroin, use heroin on a regular basis, and then you go through withdrawal, it will be unpleasant, like a bad case of the flu, but it won't kill you. So when we think about having equivalencies for drugs, it all depends on which drugs and what effect we're talking about, what route of administration people are using, and it also depends upon dose. It depends upon the setting. All of these things I try and walk the reader through slowly so they can understand that all of these drugs are psychoactive substances, and the effects primarily have to do with how much you take, what route of administration you use, like whether you take.
So help me out when you talk about responsible adults using drugs, including heroin, on a recreational basis. What does that look like? And I know you said yourself that you were using heroin on a recreational basis and then did it for 5 years. Are you still? Well, let me ask you this: are you still using heroin yourself?
In the book, I detail all of my drug use. I mean, people like these interviews pull out heroin because it's salacious, it's sexy, but I also talk about MDMA, I talk about cannabis, I talk about cocaine. I walk people through, like, each chapter has a different drug or a different class of drugs so they can understand. And so what responsible drug use looks like, just like anybody who does something like alcohol, like I may do alcohol maybe once every 6 months, if that. I may do some of these other drugs in the same kind of way, but it's just like if you decide to go and see a show, a comedian, as part of your sort of work-life balance. You just you set aside time for those kind of things, and then you engage in the activity, and then when it's over, it's over. And you still have your life, you still have your responsibilities, you still have all these things, just like you do alcohol. It's not any huge leap. People are doing this. The problem is that they're in the closet. And the ones who are being vilified for it are the ones who are having problems. And those are the ones who are also being identified. And then they are being touted as if they are typical, when in fact they are not. They're atypical. I don't
think you and I totally agree with you about this notion of how drug users are stigmatized in this country. And we know so much of that is wrapped into race and racism, particularly, as it relates to the stigma around African Americans, this notion that somehow African Americans are disproportionately the drug users in this country. And I know you debunked that myth, but I'm still trying to understand your premise about how responsible adults can use drugs and MDMA, cannabis, cocaine, heroin on a regular basis. And that's what I'm struggling to understand. Like, what does that look like?
So just think about alcohol. I don't know about your own alcohol use or your own use. So it's most people, they don't engage in alcohol use every day. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, to engage in any sort of behavior, drug use, certainly every day, because then you have to worry about things like withdrawal if you abruptly discontinue. All of these things I try and walk the reader through. So regular drug use can be something like as little as once a month, or as much as multiple times a week. I don't know how people how they set their schedule, but this happens in our country all the time. People, they take amphetamines to wake up or to be alert in some task, and they may take some sedative in the evening. I don't know whether it's a benzodiazepine like Xanax or something to relax or to decrease their anxiety. We do it all the time in our society. It's just that people are not like doing these things every day, because if you do many of these things every day, then you run the risk of becoming physically dependent. Sometimes you have to do a drug every day, like an antidepressant medication. You do that every day. Then if you abruptly discontinue, then you'll be physically dependent. But sometimes you have to, because your antidepressant helps you feel better. And then if you ever want to stop, you will have to slowly wean yourself off of it. But this happens with all kinds of drug use in our society all the time.
But are there differences in terms of properties, right? Drugs have different properties.
Yeah.
How they're made up. And those different properties then dictate how your body responds to them, correct? So is there any difference in somebody who's using cocaine recreationally versus someone who's using heroin or meth in a recreational way? Is the impact on their body going to be different?
No.
I mean, I'm worried about people who may start off recreationally. Maybe there's some trauma that they experience, and that trauma causes them to increase their use. And now they go from recreational to dependency to addiction. I mean, is that something we should be concerned about as we talk about or think about what your book is promoting, which is decriminalizing drugs, right?
No, so the book is actually promoting or advocating for legal regulation of drugs. So I'll just deal with that.
Same. If we make drugs legal, then we're not going to arrest people and make them criminal, put them in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, but there's a difference, because people need to really understand this difference. So decriminalization just means that we say we want to arrest people who are using small amounts, but drug sales still remain illegal. And that means that people are still subjected to maybe getting drugs that are tainted. So their drugs, there's no quality control in terms of what drugs you get. You don't know exactly what is in your substance. And also, the police can still have a great deal of discretion. For example, in a place like Baltimore, that is in 2015, they decriminalized cannabis. But between 2015 and 2017, they arrested more than 1,500 people for cannabis use, and 96% of those people were Black. Those kind of things happen under decriminalization still. So that's why I'm pushing for legal regulation, where police don't have that discretion, and you also have a quality control. So the government would make sure that there's no tainted substances in your substance. That's my main concern.
And under this model of legalization, would the government be able to control the amount that anyone could access, or is that again your personal freedom? Would you be
no
legalization to buy and use as much as you choose?
No, that's a good point. So that's right. Just like we do with alcohol, the government controls the amount of alcohol in each dose. Like in a bottle, we can put enough alcohol in one bottle that will kill a person, and we don't. We with something like nicotine or tobacco, the nicotine in the tobacco cigarettes, we can put enough nicotine in a cigarette to kill a person, but we don't. And so you need those kind of regulations, and you can also have additional regulations, like you can have a competency regulation, like with driving, you have to be competent before you can get behind a wheel. You can do a similar sort of thing if you have legal regulation. You can determine those things. So the goal here is not to be stupid, but to make sure that we are smart about our regulation. And so we're being smart about the regulation, and the substances are available. So we can do multiple things at the same time. Like, people oftentimes think about legal regulations like it's going to be a free fall. I think about the fact that driving an automobile is a potentially dangerous activity. In fact, 40,000 Americans die on our highways each year. But we do our best to try to regulate the safety, try to enhance safety with speed limits, with seat belts, with driving competency tests, all of these kind of things. We try to enhance the safety of their activity. We can do the same thing with drugs if we so desire.
Even with, and I guess I'm thinking about the opioid crisis that we hear so much about in the media, the epidemic, the thousands and thousands of people who've lost their lives and the impact on their families, children in foster care, homes disrupted. I see you kind of smile, like what's that?
I don't smile because of the horror that you described, because to be clear, I've had friends who have died from what was called a drug-related overdose. And also in the book, I describe ASAP Yams from the ASAP mob. He's the guy who created ASAP mob. I describe his death. He died from what appeared to be a drug-related death. His mom contacted me after his death, and she had me look at his toxicology. He had multiple drugs in his system, but he also has sleep apnea, and all of these sort of things might have contributed. But what was said was that he just died of an overdose, and without actually looking into what happened. And so one of the things I talk about in the book, and this is why I had a smile, because you threw out all the buzzwords like crises, epidemic. You also talked about children in the foster care, all of these things that the media has kind of pushed, and all of these things that I deconstruct in the book to show people how, again, they're being misled, just like what we did.
I don't think we're being misled when we talk about children in foster care. Some of these things they're factual. Now, we can disagree about the cause, but...
Well, that's what we're talking about. We're telling you, when you connect it to opioids, you've already made that connection. That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, if you're talking about children in foster care alone, outside of this topic...
But you're saying there's no connection between opioid use and some of these realities that we see in certain communities, children in foster care, families disrupted, jobs lost? There's no connection, or is there not the biggest or the connection isn't as big as being portrayed in the media? I'm just trying to understand your point.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that the connection has been exaggerated.
Okay.
Obviously, you can find a couple cases of these kind of things with some kind of connection. Let me just give you an example. Let's just think about crises. Epidemic, and it's like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about deaths? Are we talking about addiction rates? Like, addiction rates haven't changed that much, but this sort of the way we talk about it in our society act as if it's changed. There is a concern about deaths. For example, I am concerned about deaths, and so what I did was go deep into the data and try and figure out, like, what's going on. All right, so when we look at these deaths, the ones that opioids are involved in, just the ones that opioids are involved in. And when you look at what's in people's actual system, there are multiple drugs that are involved in these drug-related overdoses. That means that people have multiple drugs in their system. And then so when you say, okay, well, which one is the causal agent? What caused the overdose, if anything? Well, we didn't measure the levels in this person's system. Well, we didn't do that deep of the dive, and we didn't measure for every potential drug, and we kind of ignore alcohol in many of these cases. And so what you do when you do this sort of shabby work, what happens is that then you don't provide information to people to help them to understand what's really going on and what substances or combination of substances that people should avoid or be careful of related when it comes to this. So one of the things that we've discovered is that many of these overdose deaths involve people getting tainted drugs. They, for example, may think that they have heroin when in fact they have fentanyl. Fentanyl is a lot more potent, and they weren't seeking fentanyl. Fentanyl, when I say potent, that means less of the substance is required to have an effect. Including overdoses in some cases, particularly if you're unaware that you have this potent substance. And so if that's a problem, there are ways to deal with that specific problem, like they do in Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Colombia. What they have set up is these sort of drug checking facilities where you can submit small samples of your substance, and it gives you a chemical printout of what's contained in the substance. If something is, some adulterant is in it, then you don't take it, or you're aware that it's in it. We can do that in this country, but that is why it annoys me when in the media we have this sort of hysteria without digging deep into it and try and figure out like what's really going on, and then we can put forward a solution to deal with what's going on if we really cared about people. But we really care about is hyping this sort of thing without actually the people who are involved. That's why, you know, I kind of smile, because I just tried, I deconstruct all of this in the book, and I also do a further dive and try to help people to understand, like, the folks who are doing death investigations in this country primarily are medical examiners and coroners. Coroners are people who just typically have a high school diploma, whereas medical examiners are physicians with some training in forensic pathology. But most of the death investigation in the country are done by coroners who, for the most part, don't really know what they're doing. And so I try to help people to understand this in the book, and try to help them to understand what questions to ask when they see the headlines that talk about the opioid crises or epidemic. And I asked them to do this in the service of helping people. But the way that we talk about it currently is not helping people.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a binary choice. And when you say that you don't think the way the media reports on it reflects that they care about the people, I don't know if I agree with that. I do agree that the more information people have, the more knowledge people have, the more power they obviously have in making choices and decisions about policies. What country, in your opinion, has the best model for drug use?
You have to understand that drug policy is kind of set around the globe, is set by the major companies, mainly the U.S. And China and Russia. We have a lot of influence on drug policies around the globe because of the UN and those kind of things. And so most countries, there's no country that has legally regulated all of these drugs. Canada and Uruguay have legally regulated cannabis as a country, but no other country has legally regulated all drugs. But these other countries have basically have de facto decriminalization, meaning that they're not typically arresting their citizens for using drugs. And then some of the countries, as I noted before, put in place things like drug checking facilities such that people can submit small samples of their substance and have it tested so they're not getting these adulterants. So they have more pro-social structures built up around drug use, and they don't use drug use or this drug issue to ensure that they have a jobs program. Like the war on drugs in the United States is really a jobs program. It's a jobs programs for our police organizations. It ensures that their budgets are increased every year. It ensures that the prison industry sort of is built up. It ensures that even the media, they have these things to talk about. And there was even a time when our federal government was paying the major media outlets for negative drug stories. And so this big industry got built up around the war on drugs, such that the people are fighting to keep it in place because it's about jobs.
Are there others that in your community, your scientific community, that believe and have similar views on drug policy and the way drug policy should be changed in this country? Are there others that people who, read your book may want to also follow and read? Because if people aren't accustomed to this. This could sound very radical, could sound very controversial. And if they're trying to find, like, okay, is there a whole body of these scientists like you who are espousing this? Let me find who those folks are.
Yeah, so please understand this, science does not happen in a vacuum. And so when you ask about people who share my view, understand me as a scientist, I had multi-million-dollar grants as a result of the war on drugs. And so I was incentivized to talk about the negative sort of aspects of drug use, and so I got tenure at a good institution because of my participation in the war on drugs. So I benefited. But then, as I learned more, I saw how my community was paying the price. My cousins, my relatives, my friends, all of them having gone to jail, having this stain on their record, all of these kind of things. And so I'm one of the few Black scientists in this area. And so I and my white colleagues sometimes have different sort of concerns, interests, motivations. And so within that context, many people, they understand that the war on drugs is their great.
Can we find other Black scientists? I'm just trying to find who are your peers that have your views, even if they're not the white scientists. Are there other Black scientists that we can look to?
So my peers have my view privately. So privately, they understand. If your audience will, the thing that they should know is that I have over 100 scientific publications, and so you get scientific publications because they are peer reviewed. I have had multi-million-dollar grants, which are peer reviewed. I sat on the highest scientific.
I'm not doubting your credentials, Dr. Hart. I'm just trying to ask you, is there other scientists in this community that we can look to? I'm a lawyer, so I'm always looking for evidence. So you've laid out some pretty bold statements about the war on drugs, the use of drugs, and I'm just asking, are there other people, maybe I want to interview them, bring them on the show, read their books to that share in your views? Maybe they're not. I don't know. I'm just trying to find out.
No, I'm giving you the evidence. Peer reviewed means that.
Well, can you give me a name? I understand what peer review means.
So when you ask to give you a name, I'm telling you that publicly, it's predominantly white scientists. I don't know any Black scientists in my field.
Can you give me a name of a white scientist? They don't have to be Black.
No, my point is that publicly they won't say go all the way what I'm saying, but you can look at, for example, people who are well respected. This guy named David Nutt. He's a well respected scientist, more senior than I am, and has published even more than me. I mean, somebody like him. I mean, that's a name. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you understand that I have these peer-reviewed sort of publications and multi-million-dollar grants that I've gotten, and I am was on the highest scientific community, it tells you that that's an endorsement of my work at the highest level.
You're saying that those grants were for you to do this work that you said was to demonize drugs. These grants weren't for the work that you're doing now, where you're advocating legalization of drugs, is it? Am I confused about that?
Yeah, well, I should have just walked you through it more carefully. But so, like, if you look at the publications and the data, it's all there in the publication. So the data, but in terms of the advocacy, what I'm advocating for, the advocacy is not in the scientific papers, but the evidence is in the scientific papers.
Let me just say that I thought I read that you stopped getting some of those grants as your position evolved and as you became more of an advocate for legalization, that NIH, you now are getting more of your funding from like private sources. Is that? I read that somewhere.
Well, I'm doing different work now. So I travel all over the world. And so I no longer really have time to run a lab that I ran where I had to be in the lab 24/7. So like For example, my youngest kid is 21. I never really saw him grow up because I was always in the lab. Now, I can see my children, my family, whereas before I was in the lab all the time. And I travel. I now am a public figure. And so recently, I was in Brazil. Brazil has the largest African population outside of Nigeria. Half of that population is African, and they are primarily subjugated using this excuse with the war on drugs. And so I travel in places that where people are catching hell because of these policy, even in places like Northern Ireland. They're white folks, but they're catching hell for the same reason. So I'm trying to help people to see the connection between their subjugation and my own and my people's own subjugations. And so I don't have the time to do the kind of studies I was doing previously. And so I'm not seeking those grants. I'm at a different place in my career and a different place in my life.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Hart. Do you think what we're seeing around the country around marijuana, cannabis, how the laws are changing, states like California, for example, other states that now have legalized both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, are those laws encouraging to you that this country is becoming more open about even considering legalization of these other drugs, or do you think they're completely separate issues?
No, I think that when we look at the cannabis laws, for example, the increased sort of legal regulation by each state, state by state, I think what we're seeing is capitalism in action. And so the states that are legalizing, they understand that there are hundreds of $millions in tax revenues that cannabis legal regulation generates. And so I think these states are really in it for the loot, for the money. And that's capitalism. That's a system under which we operate. And so that's what I think it's mainly about. And I think we'll see a growing number of states. You
don't see those laws as a gateway to other laws that would legalize other drugs? Because if other drugs are legalized in the way or the way we've been talking about this morning, capitalism is going to come into play with respect to those drugs too. Different, isn't it?
Yeah, but we have to understand that it took a long time to get the country to even be able to listen to a conversation about cannabis, a more availability of cannabis without losing its collective mind. And so cannabis, when we started to legally regulate it, it was, there were more than half of the population had tried cannabis. And so you could no longer tell the same lies that we did previously, where we said that you take cannabis, it's going to lead to you doing heroin and killing your mother. We said that in the 1930s when we banned cannabis. And so, and we were believed when we said that you can't do that anymore with cannabis because so many people have tried it. But you can still say those kind of things with heroin. You can still say that you use heroin, you're going to become addicted, you're going to go down this path. If you use methamphetamine, you're going to become addicted and go down this. But you can still say these things and be believed. And so until the population is more educated about these things, I don't think we're going to get a serious movement. And that's partly what I'm trying to do with the book, trying to help people to understand that much of what they believe about drugs is not rooted in evidence.
So raising awareness, obviously, you said you're trying to do with the book, raising awareness about the lie that we've been told about the use of drugs and the war on drugs and drug policies. You just said you're not encouraged that what's happening with cannabis is going to happen with heroin and some of these other drugs. But if you could influence our policymakers, influence Biden, we talked about him a little earlier in the interview, what would you like to see them do short of legalization, which you said you don't think the country is ready for?
Mind you, I shouldn't be, or no one should be saying what the country is ready for, because we said, for example, we weren't ready for a Black president and those kind of things. And so I don't want people to become discouraged based on that. So I shouldn't be the authority on that. But what should we do short of legally regulating? I think the first thing we should do is we should have full-scale decriminalization, that meaning that no one should be going to jail for using drugs. No one.
How about selling it? Should they go to jail for selling drugs?
No, I don't think that low-level sales people should be.
Well, what about drug cartels? Let's forget low-level sales. What about, organized drug sales?
Let's be clear. Drug cartels, nobody's going to jail in drug cartels. Drug cartels, they're well connected. They have.
Okay. It's semantics. I'm asking you, you said low level. So I'm saying something other, the opposite of low level. Should people who are doing something other than low level go to jail?
That's a real difficult. I don't think so. I think that if people are, for example, if they are intentionally putting some substance in their substance that harms folks, and then they should pay the price for that. They should absolutely pay the price for that. But people who are not doing those kind of things, I don't think that they should be. They should go to jail for that kind of thing.
Okay, so you'd like decriminalization. Anything else you think the policymakers, Biden, elected officials should be doing?
Yeah, like they do in these other countries that I said they have drug checking. We should be setting up facilities such that people can submit small samples of their substances to ensure that it doesn't contain contaminants. That's really critical.
Mm-hmm. And I assume the policies like we're seeing in some cities where people are giving needles, clean needles, you would agree that those policies need to be more widespread?
Clean needles, of course, I think in many places people have access to needles, but most people are not using drugs with needles. That's like a Hollywood thing. The people who are like using drugs with needles they need oftentimes, not in all cases, but oftentimes they need far more help than needles. And so people are deluding themselves thinking that they're doing something with those needles. That's delusion.
Okay. So decriminalization, centers set up so people can test drugs. Anything else?
And we need to stop giving so much money to the police for the war on drugs. That's like number one.
Mm-hmm. And obviously there's been some change, or has there, in your opinion, been any change in the way the war on drugs or the approach to drug sales and drug use has, happened in this country, say even over the last 10 years?
I'm sorry, you said there's been some change?
I'm asking you, do you think there's been any kind of radical change in the way the U.S. approaches its drug policy? Or is it as bad as it was, when Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan had declared the war on drugs?
Yeah, so we still today arrest 1.5 million people for using drugs in this country. We still do that today. And that hasn't changed much since the first Bush era. I mean, Bush, Clinton, they really ramped up the war on drugs in terms of people going to jail.
And just lastly, as I think about, again, my own community and growing up in a community where people were addicted to drugs, and you may disagree that the addiction caused them to lose homes, cars, jobs, family, whatever, but that was what we perceived our reality to be, or the reality of our family and friends to be. So how do we provide an environment, safe environment for those people who may become dependent and have an addiction, whether it's on one drug, multiple drugs, drugs plus alcohol, whatever, that we do know cause a lot of destruction, and it's destruction in our neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods.
Okay, so what people need to do if they really care about people, not just somebody who is doing something like virtue signaling, and that's what happens with this issue all the time. If you care about people, you have to look beyond drugs. It's like saying that, I don't know, somebody gets in a car accident. We're not saying that the car, or we're not saying like we're doing with drugs, like it's not the car. We look at that person's entire life. We look and see what's really going on in that person's life. It could be related to the fact that I don't know, they recently got fired, or they never have really were plugged into our society, or they have some other mental illness or some other illness that is going on. But all of those other things are far more explanatory than looking at the drug itself. If you're just stopping to look at the drug.
But why are they mutually exclusive? I guess that's the problem I'm having. I agree with you. A person who's lost their home, we got to talk about homelessness. We got to talk about shelter. Someone who's lost their job, we got to talk about employment. Someone who's lost their kids, we got to talk about how do we get their kids out the system. But it doesn't mean that we can't also address their addiction, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that. But oftentimes, what we're talking about, we're only talking about the drug, and we're not talking about the real or the primary sort of causal agent. I mean, for example, if they're addicted to a drug like alcohol, and then you want to help them, and then they want help, you obviously got to talk about how you wean them off of alcohol. So alcohol has to come into this equation, of course. That's critical. But my point is just that don't exclusively focus on the drug, because you will miss the mark. That's what I'm saying.
I totally agree with you on that. I think it's interesting, though, that you chose alcohol in your example rather than the drugs that you talk more, prominently about in the book.
Yeah, that's a great point. I chose alcohol because alcohol, of all those drugs, alcohol is the only one that will kill you if you abruptly discontinue. That's the only one.
Heroin will kill you if you take too much of it. It can cause a respiratory depression, right? I mean, you could die if you. Yeah. I know you said a lot of people aren't shooting heroin, but there are people who shoot heroin, and there are deaths from it as well.
No, that's a great point. But the thing about the alcohol, far more people use alcohol, and far more people are subjected to this potential negative effect. And so I want to make sure that your listeners understand that's something that they're more likely to encounter, than heroin. I know heroin is sexy and so forth. And like you said, you certainly can die from respiratory depression, taking too much heroin, particularly if you are a novice. You can die from respiratory depression with alcohol too. Again, these examples I lay out in the book for the reader, and it's important that people read, because I got 30 years of scientific knowledge that went into this book, and people have, particularly people who have a Black audience, they have focused on the salacious stuff, and meanwhile, they're not allowing folks to get the benefits of the book. And this is from a person from the hood who has always I have a demonstrated history of caring about our community, but our community are benefiting the least from this information that I put in the book, because of oftentimes our media personalities are so moralistic and really don't understand this thing of like allowing people to live their life as they like to live, as long as they're not.
I'm running out of time, but I got to go there with you. So you're saying Black journalists are moralistic and are preventing this information from getting to the Black community? You're finding more receptiveness or receptivity. I don't even know if that's the right word, but
I think that's it. More
in the white community, in the white media.
Yeah, I'm not saying the white media per se, but what I'm saying in our communities, many of the journalists who are covering this topic, my book, have covered it from the moralistic perspective, and with this sort of perspective of, I've seen all of this destruction in my community, and they uncritically blame drugs. And that means that you're not focused on these other issues that are more explanatory. And so that's what I'm saying. And I try to explain these things in the book. And so if people get stuck at the moralism, then they miss the potential benefit for our community. And that's been a little frustrating for me.
Wow. Well, I don't. Okay. So back to the comparison, though, you're making. You said Black journalists. So, but are you saying that you're not running into that same issue when you're doing interviews or talking to people outside the African American press? They're not expressing moral outrage in the same way?
Far less so. Yes, absolutely. Far less so. I mean,
That's interesting.
There are dozens of videos, YouTubes all around. I mean, people have access to this. Don't just take my word. Just go and look at it.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. And I would imagine, I don't know these people, I haven't watched these videos, but I imagine they're coming from what they believe to be a place of love. They love the community as much as you do, right?
I think people do think they're coming from a place of love, and that is absolutely right. But you hope that people can make the shift when you help them to understand, like, okay, our moralism, if you just say, you shouldn't do this, you tell an adult this, that's not the most helpful solution to people. And then they're not going to think that you're receptive, or they can come to you if they have a problem. And so you hope people will be able to say, all right, cool. Let's check it. Let's try another approach, because I really care about people. And so I have to make sure that I have an approach that they will find receptive.
So I'm not going to ride for those people who I don't know, and I don't know where they're coming from. But I am going to say this, and I think you can agree with this, that they, like me and you, have seen so much harm and destruction in our community. Let's agree, we all love the community. So I'm going to just give them a little grace, because if people have been told for years and years and years that this is the problem and this is the cause, then, in one book, one moment, one interview, to now change their thinking about that and to be open to the fact that maybe they've been manipulated or misled, it can take some time. So
absolutely,
give them grace, and it's a whole lot of, as you said, moralistic, maybe religious, a tradition wrapped into that. So there's a lot, that perhaps is driving some of that. And I don't think it's, again, lack of love for the community or lack of trying to find solutions that are going to help ultimately. So
I absolutely agree with you. But so this is not a comment about the people who are viewing this. This is a comment about the professionals, the journalists. So
and that's what to give them a little grace too, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
about. Bought into this, what you're saying. We've all, been fed, right?
No, absolutely. All I'm saying is, like, as a professional, what you do, particularly because you have this influence, what a professional does is that a professional deals with the argument, and in that way, that means that they have to read the information, deal with the arguments, and then present, like, the tough questions that they're struggling with. But that means that they have to first be a professional and read the arguments and then present the arguments, as opposed to simply coming to a discussion, a professional discussion about this without having done the reading. And that's all I'm saying. I'm talking about that. That's lack of professionalism.
Yeah, I'm going to go look at some of those videos, and I'm going to have you back. We'll have a conversation about some of those videos, because I'm at a little disadvantage having not seen the video. And like I said, I'm not riding for these people because I don't know who they are. I don't know what they've said to you, but you make a good case. Absolutely. People should read. They should be knowledgeable, and they should ask smart and tough questions. Shouldn't come in with conceived notions. You have spent, like you said, 30 years of your career studying this, doing these scientific studies. So we got to give you credit for doing that work. I do, though, think that when you're presenting people with something that seems so radical, that I can understand why you're getting some of the pushback that you've described you've gotten. But this has been a very fascinating conversation. I want to go look at some of those videos. I'm sorry, go ahead.
When we talked about getting rid of slavery, that was radical.
Yeah.
But my ancestors' humanity was no less before slavery than after slavery. And so this notion that it's radical only to those people who didn't see my humanity as the same as theirs. That's the same case I'm making here. It's not really radical. If you just see people's humanity in the same way you see your own humanity, this is not radical. This is.
I don't know if I agree. I'm out of time. I totally disagree with you on that, though, and the analogy to slavery. But that's for another day. Like I said, I'm gonna look at some of those videos. I'm gonna have you back. We can continue this conversation. I want to thank you. Your book is Drug Use for Grownups. pick it up, read it. As Dr. Hart said, don't just read the headlines, don't read the sound bites, read the book so that you're clued into what his arguments are, and all the data and all the science behind his arguments. I thank you for writing the book. I thank you for joining me this morning. Like I said, really fascinating conversation. Best of luck. I know you're on a book tour. You're out talking to folks. You're doing lots of interviews. This is the paperback edition of the book you said came out last year, the hardcover. So it's been out there for a while. So people have had an opportunity to read it and to form opinions. But these kinds of conversations, I think, are so helpful, right? This is how we get to these places where changes are made in our society. And at the end of the day, we know the war on drugs didn't work. So we can agree on that. That was a complete disaster, destroyed Black families, led to mass incarceration, didn't reduce drug use or drug sales or the devastation in our communities across this country. So indeed, we need a new direction.
Let's be clear. You talk about the war on drugs in the past tense. It's still going on, and it did work. And I point that out in the book because if it didn't work, it wouldn't still be going on. It's working for a number of people. It's just not working for us.
Well, when I say it didn't work, that's what I'm talking about.
But we have to understand that there's a reason it continues because it's working. And we have to understand that. It's
working for certain people,
That's
working
right.
to support and uphold some systems that are harmful to us as a community. So when I say not working, I mean not working to end the devastation in Black and brown communities. That's how
But I try and make the point that people should understand that it's working and it's still happening because it's working.
Yeah. All right. I take your point. Point well taken. Again, thank you, Dr. Hart. Pick up the book, Drug Use for Grownups. I'd love to have you come back and we continue this discussion. But best of luck again on the book and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Carl Hart for spending some time with me this morning. Again, his book is Drug Use for Grownups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. Make sure you pick up a copy of this book. You may not agree with everything Dr. Hart said, but one thing I do totally agree with Dr. Hart is we should not criticize the book or his opinions unless we have read it. And the book is full of lots of ideas and concepts that you may find radical, you may find controversial, but I think he offers a really unique perspective and a way for us to think about how this country does treat drug use and drug addiction. Now, as you can tell from the interview, I didn't agree with everything that Dr. Hart said, but I do agree that the way this country has treated drug addicts is wrong. The stigma that drug addicts face is wrong. We should be talking about drug addiction and drug use as a health problem, as a health crisis, rather than as a criminal justice issue. We all know, and you guys have seen the shows that I've done on this issue of how the war on drugs, which Dr. Hart says isn't over, and I agree with him on that, has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. It's torn families apart. It has devastated Black communities across this country. It has not solved any problem. Dr. Hart said it has propped up law enforcement agencies, other industries that have profited from the suffering that has occurred in Black communities around this country. So I agree with him wholeheartedly. We need a new approach to the way we treat drug use and drug addiction in this country, one that doesn't penalize and criminalize and destroy Black communities and Black men in particular, who end up being disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system for drug charges and who are treated so vastly different than white people, white men in particular, who are charged, and if they are charged at all, for drug use. So I am grateful for Dr. Hart for opening up this discussion and giving us an opportunity to start thinking about different ways. Now, Dr. Hart does have lots of critics. Some critics say that he plays fast and loose with the science and with the facts, and that a lot of the studies that he referenced today included very small sample sizes, and he got to results that are not validated and supported by other scientists, but he told us he has over 100 peer-reviewed articles. So I think what we can take away from this is that this is a topic where experts disagree and some experts agree. And it's up to us to do our own research, to read his book, to read other books, to read other studies, and see where we come down on this issue. But I think we can all agree we need a new drug policy. We need a new approach to drugs. We need one that does not harm any aspect or any demographic in this country, and particularly one that does not harm the Black community. I'm out, y'all. I'm going to probably have Dr. Hart back. I'm going to look at some of those videos he told me to look at, and I'm going to have him back. So this is a conversation I'm very interested in, and I want to continue this conversation because I think there's something there that we all can learn. So be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together, and pick up a copy of his book.